My mother just came back from playing a huge chess tournament in Gibraltar. It was called the Gibraltar Chess Festival Battle of the Sexes, and it consisted of two teams, one women's team and one men's team, competing against each other, having the same average rating, same average age, and total prize fund of £100,000. Now, she just came back, but I wanted to show you some of the games that she played during that tournament. I already showed you the Eric Rosen versus my mom game, but today I'm going to be showing you the first round of the tournament. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more recaps of my mother's games, just let me know in the comments down below because I would love to do it. In the first round, my mother was facing Grandmaster Bilel Bellahcene, who is a 2500 Grandmaster. And my mother has also been going through this game with me prior to this video, and she has told me some of the insights that she had, so I'll be sharing those with you now. My mother started with the move Knight f3, which is a very flexible first move. It can transpose to a lot of different openings. Knight f6 is played, and now c4. E6, Knight c3, and here my mother actually was expecting Bilal to go d5, which is a very common move, just to kind of get hold of the center. If d5, d4, this would have transposed to a Queen's Gambit decline, but he surprised her with bishop b4. In chess, there's a big psychological factor that if one player is not expecting player to do something, it feels like the player that surprised the other one has a little bit of a psychological advantage. So my mom decided to go for a move here that's not the most common move, but it's playable. It's just a little bit unusual, which is the move Queen b3. Now, the idea of Queen b3 is that she wants to defend this knight with the queen so that if bishop takes, she can take back with the queen. As if she would take with the pawn, she would be getting those pawns doubled. And generally in chess, you don't really want to have double pawns. But at the same time, this move is a little bit unusual because after a move like c5, a3, bishop a5, this queen is blocking this pawn on b2. Sometimes the idea is to go b4. So we can see, for instance, that if this queen was on c2, which is one of the most, common moves in this position, just to still defend this knight with the queen, but allowing a3 and at some point maybe b4, then we can see that at some point there could be ideas of rook b1, b4. So it's a little bit more common to have the queen over here on c2, not blocking this pawn on b2. But she went for Queen b3, attacking the bishop, but also doing a move that's a little bit more unusual, just to surprise Bilal back. Now, Bilal in this position thought for a little while before he went for his move c5, which is a very, very common move. The idea is just that you're, putting a pawn in the center. This pawn over here is controlling the d4 square, but it's also defending this bishop on b4. Now, here my mother went for a3. So bishop a5, if now the bishop would take on c3, then this would not really be that great for black, because then black would be giving their bishop pair for nothing really, as my mother is just taking back with the queen. There's not going to be any damage done to the pawn structure, nothing like that. No. So bishop a5, and now e3 was played. The idea of going e3 is at some point to maybe control d4. But right now, the idea is just to bring this bishop out so that my mother can castle. Those are the things that she wants to do immediately. Castles, bishop e2. And now black went for d5. This is a very common and understandable move. Black has a pretty great center. It's controlling a lot of the squares over here. So you generally want to take the center in chess because that's where the action is happening, basically. So you want to kind of control the squares where all the action is happening. And here my mother went for castles. In this position, if something like, for instance, d4 would be played, then this wouldn't really be an issue for white, because then white would just go knight a4, attacking this pawn. This pawn would perhaps be a little bit weak, and my mother would have the idea of going queen c2, rook b1, and b4, or even queen c2 and b4 immediately, as if pawn takes, this pawn would be hanging over here. So she had those sort of ideas in this position, if d4, so she wasn't really afraid of it, which is why she just castled. But Bilal went for knight c6. And now my mother, she didn't really think that she had that many moves. She needs to either go back with the queen to go b4 or b3 and bring her bishop out. b4 is not possible right now, but maybe in the future. Or she needs to go d3 or d4. Right now, she needs to bring this bishop out, which is her last piece to develop. So, because she thought that d3 was a little bit passive, she decided to go for d4. Now, in this position, she is immediately attacking the c-pawn, and she's also stopping black from playing e5. If, for instance, she would go queen c2 in this position, she was afraid that maybe at some point there could be either e5 or d4, e5, and she just didn't really like the fact that this queen was not really attacking this pawn on d5 anymore. We can see with the queen and the knight and the pawn, there's 3 attackers over here, so she wanted to go d4. Now, in this position, c takes d4 was played. The c-pawn was under attack, so he had to do something about it. E takes d4 was played, and it's important to take with the pawn, because if you take with the knight, then all of a sudden, I mean, black doesn't really need to even take back. I mean, it could happen that white just loses a little bit of their center, basically, because with the pawn, you're basically controlling all these squares, but with the knight, if the knight doesn't take back, then you just don't have any good central pawn. So she took with the pawn, and then after d takes c4, it was important for her to take with the queen, because if she would take with the bishop, then the pawn on d4 is hanging. So there's just knight takes d4 in this position. Right now the queen is hanging, but let's say that the queen wasn't hanging and there was rook d1 check, it wouldn't work even because of knight takes a3 check. But of course right now the queen is just simply hanging, so this doesn't work either. But queen takes c4. Now this pawn is defended. I mean, h6 was played. The reason for that is that Bilel wanted to stop the bishop from going to g5 and pinning, because he also has the idea of going knight e7, knight d5. In general, it's a very common thing to want to put a piece in front of the pawn, or just control the square in front of the pawn, just so that the pawn can never exchange itself. This pawn right here on d4 is an isolated pawn because there's no pawns that are defending that pawn. This pawn is all alone and only has bigger pieces that can defend it. Now, a lot of times you want to push this pawn and exchange it, just because this pawn can become a big weakness. For instance, black here, as they're playing against this isolated pawn, you want to exchange pieces just because the only thing that can be good with an isolated pawn is if you can develop more pieces. Now, if you've exchanged all the pieces that you're, developing, then that's just not going to be good for white. You're not going to have any attack, you're not really going to have anything, and the pawn is just going to become a weakness. So those are some important things to note when you have a position like this with an isolated pawn. In this position, my mother went for rook d1. You're bringing another piece into the game. This rook on f1 is not doing anything. Now it's getting activated. And now knight e7 was played. And once again, the idea is just to put a knight over here right in front of the pawn, just to stop the pushing. So knight e5 was played. Knight e d5. This knight is better situated over here than this knight is over there. And bishop f3. Now, basically just threatening this knight. So bishop d7 was played in this position. You can see lots of areas that I'm going to be explaining right now. In this position, it may seem like at this point this knight is hanging, because after knight takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, and queen takes, it looks like white is just simply getting a pawn. But the reason why my mom didn't go for this is that there is this bishop a4 move. And now we can see that this bishop pair is so incredibly strong. The bishop is attacking this rook. The queen is under attack. So the only way to save the rook is basically to exchange the queen, to force black to deal with this queen first. And after rook takes a d8, you can see that this rook cannot really defend this pawn anymore, because if rook f1 to kind of save the rook, then this pawn is hanging. But if rook d3, there's bishop c2 over here. After the rook goes somewhere, this pawn would be hanging. So this is not really something that my mother wanted to enter. She thought that the bishop pair was really good, and even if there may be something like rook g3, so that after rook takes d4, there's bishop takes h6 because of this pin. After something like king h7, this pawn is still under attack. It's not really being good at being an isolated pawn. It's just a very weak pawn. So, it's going to be equal material at some point, and black has the bishop pair, and this bishop pair is just very strong. And white's pieces are a bit misplaced as well. So instead, for taking over here, she went for bishop d2, just to bring her piece out and to defend this knight. And also so because sometimes, this bishop might be a little bit under attack if this knight moves at some point, perhaps. So rook c8 was played over here to attack the queen. Now my mother went queen b3. She still wanted to have the attack on this knight. Bishop b6 was played here. After bishop b6, things have actually changed a little bit, because now after knight takes knight and pawn takes knight, which is what happened in the game, you actually have this intermediate move, bishop b4, which is what my mother played. The idea of this move is that you're defending this pawn now with the rook. You're also attacking this rook, so the rook has to move, and after the rook moves, there's actually bishop takes d5 in this position, because after knight takes d5, and queen takes d5. This is just a pawn that white has won. Now, this was not played in the game. Instead of taking back, bishop e6 was played by Bilel. But the idea here, and what my mother thought, that it would be better to take like this, because after bishop e6 in this position, queen takes and rook takes, this pawn is actually pretty weak. And even if there may be bishop c5 to defend it, even though white is a pawn up, black has the bishop pair and black has a really good piece activity. This might have been the best thing that Bilel could have gone for, but he decided to not take on d5. He went for bishop e6. My mother took on e6, rook takes e6, knight f3. Now the knight is coming back to defend this pawn. This knight is very good over here. Rook c7. Now this move was a little bit surprising. She was expecting a move sort of like queen d5, exchanging queens, just because it's important to put a piece over here in d5. Let's say queen takes, knight takes on d5. This would actually be pretty balanced, because even though black is a pawn down, their pieces are very great, and there's no piece pretty much that's taking this knight away in the upcoming moves, as there's not light square bishop. This could have been a better way of trying to equalize for black, but instead rook c7 was played with the idea of going rook d7 and doubling up rooks. My mother went for h3 just to get some air for the king, to not fall for any back ranks. Rook d7 was played over here, attacking this pawn, and that is why actually my mother went for rook ac1. The idea here is if bishop takes d4, which wasn't played in the game, knight takes d4, rook takes d4, rook takes d4, queen takes d4, there's rook c8 check actually. And after something like king h7, there would be queen c2 check. Now white would be getting a lot of play. For instance, something like queen e4, then there would be queen takes e4, rook takes e4, and rook c7. And now one of these pawns is hanging. So that is basically the idea. If something like knight e8, well, then we can see that this knight is pinned. So after something like bishop c3, this bishop would become incredibly strong, and there might be some queen b5 ideas pressuring this knight, etc. The pawn on b7 is also hanging. So there's a lot of threats, which was the idea of going rook c1. So bishop c7, rook c2, the idea of this is to double up and always have the defense of this pawn. Knight d5, she went for bishop d2 in this position. Rook b6 was played, queen d3, when I get the queen out, but this rook is doing great defending this pawn. Rook e6, black is just trying to activate his pieces. Rook c1 was played over here. Queen e8, just kind of doing kind of small moves, just trying to reroute their pieces to better squares. But now my mother, she has now these two rooks on the c file, which are very strong together. The immediate threat is to go rook takes knight, rook takes rook, and then the bishop would be hanging. Just why black decided to go for bishop b6. My mother went for rook c8. Now it may seem like, you know, there's a pin going on here where my mother's getting the rook, but there is rook d8 here blocking. In this position, instead of exchanging here, which one may want to do or whatever, my mother went queen c8 just to really like hold everything tight. Typically when you're playing chess and you're having a position where you're attacking, you don't want to exchange things. You kind of want to keep your threats going. So basically, the idea of queen c4 is that if rook takes, queen takes c8, queen takes c8, rook takes c8, and king h7, my mother is just a pawn up. Her pieces are super active. You know, king can just go into f1, and this is just a really good endgame for her. So rook e d6, just to put some extra protection of this knight. Rook takes d8 was played, rook takes d8, and now rook e1 was played over here. And the idea of that is just to kick the queen away. Also to just put your rook in an other open file. This file is pretty packed in terms of, like, you know, pieces just protecting a lot of squares. It's kind of hard to enter. So she just went to another open file. Queen d7 was played, knight e5. She's just trying to activate all her pieces and pushing forward. Now there's also the indirect threat of maybe at some point threatening on f7 if the queen and knight would move. Queen c7 was played. Now once again, my mother, she wants to exchange queens here. Rook c1 was played in this position just because if queen takes and rook takes, my mother will be getting some really active pieces. So queen d6 was played instead. a4 was played. The idea is to go b4, a5 perhaps at some point. a6 was played. Knight f3, just rerouting the pieces, trying to bring it back, defending this pawn over here. Bishop a7. Queen b3, attacking this pawn over on b7. Queen d7, defending the pawn. We can see that there's lots of kind of small moves that are happening. And now bishop a5 was played. The idea is just to throw in the rook. If b6 is played, then the b6 pawn is going to become a huge weakness. Rook e8 was played, which makes sense, putting the rook in an open file. Knight e5 again, the knight is coming back, but now the queen needs to decide where it's gonna go. Queen e6 was played, and the reason why my mother did not take on b7 is because this pawn would be hanging, so that just wouldn't be good. So rook e1 was played first, putting the rook in the same file as the queen. Rook e7 was played, defending this pawn. Knight f3, now the queen is under attack. Queen c6, so my mother went for the exchange of the rooks. Once again, she's trying to exchange. There are some queen c1 ideas now, and that is why in this position, it was important for my mother to move this bishop. My mother needed to be kind of alert about this, because now if my mother doesn't do anything, if she just does a random move, then there would be queen c1 check, and after something like, you know, king h2, then there might be queen f4 check, and then this pawn might be hanging. So she needed to be kind of alert with those moves, which is why she went bishop c3, just that there would never be queen c1. Bishop b8, Bilal is trying to just take care of this diagonal. Knight e5, just blocking this whole diagonal. And now he actually exchanged his bishop for the knight because he probably thought that this endgame with the knight and queen was okay. Typically, it's known that knights and queens work really well together because the queen already does the function of the bishop, right? The queen can go in diagonals. But the queen and the knight, they actually complete each other because the queen cannot do what the knight does. The knight is the only piece that has something that the queen doesn't have. So he probably thought that this endgame would be fine. My mother didn't want to exchange the bishop, so she just went bishop d2, also stopping any knight f4 ideas. Because if the knight comes to f4, then this knight could actually become pretty strong, threatening on g2, etc. So knight b6. Now a5 was played, and in this position, Bilal actually made a bit of a mistake. This pawn on a5 is first attacking this knight, but it's two. This one pawn, it's basically stopping the advancement of this other pawn. If this pawn would push, then, you know, this pawn would be exchanging it. So it's pretty common to want to advance this a pawn as much as possible when there is this pawn structure. Now the knight went to c4, which, you know, makes sense, attacking this pawn, attacking this bishop, attacking this pawn at some point if the bishop moves somewhere that's not protecting it. Bishop c3, so it kind of makes sense, but we can see that this knight cannot really go to any place from here. The knight is actually trapped in this position in the sense that it can't go anywhere right now, right? It's trapped. Queen c7 was played, and now this is when it really started to go wrong. Now there was queen a4, which is a really beautiful move that my mom played. And the idea of this move is just simply that there are some, like, one, the knight is under attack, but as we're gonna be seeing pretty soon, let's say that you would do something random, then there's the idea of going queen e8 check, king h7, and then e6, and then opening up for this bishop, basically. For instance, pawn 6, okay, now this pawn is hanging, but this would now be a complete disaster because now this bishop is becoming so strong. We're talking about this pawn blocking for this bishop, but now this bishop would be a great attacking piece. So to avoid any queen e8 check and then e6 ideas, Bilal went for queen c8, but then in this position, there was queen d1, which is very nice. We're going to be seeing that the idea is to either go queen d4, queen d5, and just centralizing your queen and putting the queen in a really great square. b6 was played, and now there was queen d4. The bishop and the queen are becoming a battery, looking at this g7 checkmate point. But also right now, their threat is to go a takes b6 and just being a pawn up is white. Bilal went queen e6. It's one stopping e6, which is a big threat to open up for the queen and the bishop in checkmating. But after queen d8 check, and king h7 and queen d3 check, which is a very nice idea, Bilal actually resigned because after king g8, there's a takes b6, and if queen takes b6, well, then he's losing the piece. And if knight takes b6, queen takes a6, Bilal would just be 2 pawns down, and it's 5 versus 3. He didn't want to play it, so he actually resigned in this position. This was basically the first game, and a game that she was very happy with, which is why I wanted to share with you. I hope that you guys enjoyed the review and recap of this game, and if you want to see more analysis like this from me, then go ahead and let me know in the comments down below, and consider, you know, leaving a like on this video. That would be absolutely amazing. Hopefully this is being educational for you and you're learning 1 or 2 things about how you can improve your chess or how different positions can be analyzed. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful morning, evening, day, whatever it is where you live, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.